Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Between Two Studs. I'm Alex Stud.
And I'm Ron Stud.
And Ron, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling 22.
22 it is.
I don't know if you're a T Swift fan, but
I got that reference.
Today we have wonderful friend Dave Miller on the show. How you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm glad to be here.
I was going to say, this will kind of dovetail into our first opening question, but it's been a while since I've seen you, and it's great to see you again. All right, David. So as you said that you've listened to the show a little bit before, one of the things that we do with all of our guests is we do a little round we like to call the Ember Round. And we use that as an opportunity to kind of get to know who you are, and we try to keep it pretty fun. So, and I have to say, Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, but we haven't had a single guest disappoint yet. So the pressure is really high. But we're going to start with the easy one first. How do you know us?
I met Alex, I guess, freshman year of college. We both went to Westchester. He was in the same building as me, in the same dorm. And
Hall.
Yeah, we just had a mutual group of friends and kind of hung out together. And then freshman year and sophomore year, we both ended up being in Killinger again. And so that just sort of solidified things, which was cool, and just stuck together throughout college and such. And then we've been on and off after college, but we've had some opportunities to get back together and see each other, and it's been great. So yeah. And I got to meet you, Ron, when I was living out in England, and we decided my wife and I go to Munich for Oktoberfest, and then you guys were taking a trip, and we met up there and had way too much beer, but it was a great time.
Is there ever too much beer in Munich on Oktoberfest?
I don't think so.
Yeah, probably not, but
we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that was certainly a very, very drunk couple of days.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Let's get a little bit more background about you, Dave. Tell us about yourself, your areas of interest.
So I grew up sort of north of Philadelphia, maybe 45 minutes outside the city. I went to Westchester, right? I was a history major, and I was like, boy, what do I do with a degree in history? And I was like, I kind of have no idea. But I was always kind of drawn to the military, so I did Air Force ROTC while I was in college. So I trained while I was doing college, and then when I graduated, I commissioned in the Air Force as lieutenant. And then from there, my first assignment was out in England. I spent 3 years out there and doing good stuff there. After that, I went to California, out near Sacramento. Spent about 2 years out there, and I'm now in Texas, northern Texas, right on the border with Oklahoma. I'm married. Just had a baby girl 6 months ago. So
congratulations!
Thanks. Yeah, she's super cute, and yeah, I don't know. I guess that's me.
What are you currently drinking right now, Dave?
So I couldn't find any Malort. Is that the stuff?
Yeah.
I couldn't find any of it.
Well, it's funny because about a week ago, when Dave and I scheduled this, he texts me and he goes, "So does that mean I need to find Malort?" And I said, "Good luck." And apparently you looked all over your area. Not surprised that you couldn't find it.
Yeah.
But it's the spirit. It's the spirit that counts.
Right.
Pun intended.
Yeah, I'm drinking a little bit of some single malt scotch here. I got a Glenfiddich 18. My wife got me for my 30th birthday, which I just had a couple months ago. So
congratulations.
I'm glad you're enjoying a nice bottle. You're celebrating with us on Between Two Studs.
That's right. So I got my dram here, so it's a good drink.
There you go. Cheers.
Ron, what are you drinking tonight?
So tonight I'm actually teetotaling a little bit, and by teetotaling, I've legitimately got tea. So I'm enjoying some Pu'er.
Teetotal. I see. I see what you did there.
Right? So I'm enjoying some nice Pu'er tonight. A little bit different for a type of tea, but for anybody who's interested, that's a very earthy type of tea, and it tastes good. So enjoying that. And what about you, Alex? What are you enjoying?
For the first time, my wife a couple months ago, she went and visited one of her friends in St. Louis, and she brought back a bottle of Cardinal Sin Pride American Single Malt Whiskey.
Ooh.
And it's I'll be honest, it's okay. It's not the greatest thing in the world. Doesn't have a ton of flavor that I would normally expect in a bourbon, but it's doing the job. It's doing the job. I'm starting to feel it. So it means it's effective.
That's all that matters sometimes, right?
At least you can say it's a very attractive bottle, right? It looks good.
It does look good.
I agree.
But yeah.
I agree. And the little apple there for those who, for the two of you, you can enjoy the apple there.
I mean, I would pick that up off a shelf and be like, maybe I'll drink this.
Yeah. And to be fair, too, you don't know until you try it. So that's one of the great parts about going out, trying different things. Worst case, you say, just probably won't get it again. But that's why either way, it's cool. Dave, here's our next one. And we kind of alluded to this earlier. And I feel like Alex and I, we're digging ourselves into a really deep ditch because Hannah she threw down the gauntlet on episode 20. And she said, this question that you're posing to all of our guests, and it's a really tough question, Alex and I have to answer by the end of the season. But no pressure. Pick a piece of art that you like, that you feel that represents you. Could be a song, movie, book, painting, whatever. And tell us what that is.
I totally, you guys sent me the pre-show notes and totally skipped over this question and did not read it at all. And so I was like, oh, there was a question, and I was like, so I just thought of this in the last 30 seconds, but I still love it. So anyway, one of my favorite books is The Phantom Toll Booth by Norton Juster. I first read this in 5th grade. So it's a children's book, right? But it's about this kid who's super bored with life, and he gets transported through this toll booth and goes to this magical land and just has a bunch of, adventures sort of thing. But it's such a fun, whimsical book, but it also looks at life in a really interesting way. Just everything is sort of topsy-turvy and nothing sort of works the way it's supposed to, but yet it all sort of makes sense.
Is it a little bit like an Alice in Wonderland kind of spin?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. A very classic book, one I really enjoy and I've always kind of cherished. So just for the way, the outlook on life, right, of always looking at things differently.
So are you looking forward to reading that to your daughter someday?
Someday, definitely. So yeah, I will. I've also been there was a series that I read as a kid called the Red Wall series. It's a bunch of mice and rabbits and they're anthropomorphic, but I've started kind of picking those up as I see them at bookstores, and one day I'll pass them down to her and she'll be like, Dad, this book's terrible, and never read it.
Well, love that answer. It's funny, Dave, when Ron was reading the question and he mentioned that you could name a song, immediately in my head I was thinking
I know
about
what you're gonna say.
I was thinking about you, because when we lived in the dorms together, he lived on the 3rd floor, I lived on the 2nd floor, but you could know that Dave was in his room a mile away because he'd have his door wide open and blasting music while he was on his computer.
I was not blasting it.
Listen, I loved it, but I was always amazed that he never got in trouble by the RA. The song that sticks out in my mind, and there were a bunch because you had this Dave Miller playlist, but the one that to this day, if I hear it on the radio or driving down the road or whatever, I think of you, is Steal My Sunshine by Len.
That's the song?
What's the song you're thinking of?
What is it? Teenage Dirtbag by...
And 1-2 by Wheatus.
Yeah, Wheatus, yeah.
Both of those songs actually are both classic late 90s pop songs that were part of your playlist.
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of me that was like, I wonder if he's going to name one of those songs. But I assume you don't listen to those songs in the same frequency that you did in college.
No. So it's actually funny. The other day I was on Reddit and there's some video or whatever in their song, and in the comments somebody said, "Oh, this is Herb Alpert," and I was like, "That's that album that Stud had on his wall." And I was like, I wonder if that guy's any good. So I put it on, right, and I'm like, "Yo, this guy's dope." I've been listening to so much Herb Alpert lately, and then I listened to the episode with, who was it? Was it Matt
Rubin? It was actually both Rubin and Matt Toll
brought up Herb Alpert.
Both brought up Herb Alpert. So you were the 3rd episode
Yeah.
bring that
to
up.
talk about Herb Alpert. And I'd say the average age of our guests are probably 30 years old. Yet we've had quite a number of guests talk about Herb Alpert, and I absolutely love it.
That dude's great. Love him. So never would have listened to it if it wasn't for you having that stupid Whipped Cream and Other Delights album on your wall. So anyway,
well, and I only got into Herb Alpert because of Matt Toll.
Right.
So it's all, it's all moving. It's all secular.
Yeah.
Love it. All right. So good news, Dave. You've passed the Emma round.
Good.
How does it feel?
A little toasty, right? We're warming up some. I love it.
I got to say, not to make you feel any better or any worse, but no one has ever failed the Ember round. I'm waiting for the day where the episode is really short. It's like a 5-minute episode. People are like, "Oh, there must have been an issue when they uploaded the video." No, they failed, and that was the end. We ended the show. So you made it. You made it through. We're going to talk a little bit about your career because it is really interesting. You talked about it very briefly, how you've traveled quite a bit in the military. It was less than a year, right, after you graduated college. You got married. You and your wife, Irene, you're living as expats on a military base in northeast, I guess more eastern England.
Yeah.
Like, what was that like? What was that about?
So, it's no surprise to anybody that, we have military bases all over the world, right? And so it's just one of those things. Got to say, right, got to put the disclaimer out here. This is all my personal opinion and does not constitute an official policy of the Air Force or anything like that, right? But so, we have these agreements with other militaries where we'll use their bases, we'll live on them, we pay some taxes kind of thing, and in return, they get our business sort of thing, and there's some militaries sort of sharing over. So that's kind of what we were doing there. So there was some British military on our base, but mostly Americans. We're just out there doing what we got to do. We had tanker aircraft out there. So anytime that our military aircraft would come over the Atlantic, they'd get topped off by the aerial refuelers, and so they can get across. But that was sort of
were most of the planes that were coming in from the Statesman, were a lot of them coming in from Dover Air Force Base?
Some would come from Dover. A lot of them were from McGuire, actually, in Jersey. So Dover's aircraft tended to go to Spain, and then they would go onward to the Middle East. So,
well, it was fascinating because I know this is a total aside, but where Ron and I lived, as you know, in Delaware, and they would do all these trainings,
mm-hmm.
and they would cycle. We're 30 miles north of Dover, so these giant, are they C5s? I mean, these are massive planes, and they're flying like every 15 minutes over our house.
Yeah,
these things were monsters. I can't imagine they get very much fuel. They're not very fuel efficient, but they were incredible beasts.
Oh yeah.
I think for our listeners, if you haven't seen one of these in person or even been close to them, I mean, what's it like, 8 stories tall or something like that?
I mean, maybe up to the tail,
but somewhere around there. I mean, they are tall, but also just long, massive. And what can you fit, like 2 tanks in them or something?
Yeah, I think 3. So the fun fact is the cargo hold of a C5 is longer than the Wright brothers' first flight.
Well, and they're considerably bigger than any commercial airline, right? Jet, right? They're like
sort of. I mean, it's one of those, like, so 747s, they're somewhat larger, and then A380s are even larger than that. But the nice thing about C5s is the cargo hold is gigantic. It's just the entire plane is cargo hold, whereas 747s are sort of split up and that sort of thing. So we actually contract a lot of cargo variant 747. So instead of having seats, it's just a flat cargo floor, and they actually have a higher gross takeoff weight and can carry more single pallets than a C5 can. But you can't fit a tank on a 747, right? Because it's all just a small little door.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting you being an expat. Alex has not been an expat yet, but I have also been an expat. So sorry, Alex, for excluding you on this one. But living abroad, one of the things that I remember is there's several things that you kind of miss about the US, and then there's things that you also miss now that you've been back here in the States. What are some of the things that you missed while you lived over in England? And then what are some of the things that you miss now that you wish you could have gotten or that are easier to get back when you were in England?
Yeah. I would say one thing about England is their roads are considerably worse in that like they will just have these like tiny roads that you can barely fit a car down. And you know, the GPS, you'll be following that and you're like on this road, whatever, and then it's like, oh, turn right. You're okay, turn right. And you're all of a sudden like hedges on both sides, and it's only as wide as your car. And you're like, I like this is a 2-lane road here. Like you're supposed to pass somebody. And so it gets crazy. Although I will say roundabouts are far superior to lights in most capacities. So
if you know how to use them, that's the biggest problem I've noticed in the States.
Right.
The roundabouts in theory are incredible, but if no one knows how to use them,
then they're an absolute death trap, because you get on them here and you see other people who get to them and they just kind of panic, and you're like, oh boy, it's going to be one of them.
And so like the roads make it so that like it just takes a lot longer to get places just because the roads are a lot less efficient. But that's because they're literally, you know, like their roads are older than the United States is, right? So it's just a matter of course, right? Definitely something I missed.
What about food?
Yeah. English food is kind of weird because like sometimes it's really good. Like you get like a nice like fresh fish and chips or like a meat pie. Like, oh man, like that's good. But like other times it's just you're like like trying to find some Tex-Mex in England, forget about it. Like there's no Chipotle. You can't even find a Taco Bell, right? Like it's just like you want it on a tortilla, forget about it. It's not happening, right? Yeah, English food is really hit or miss. Their beers is kind of weird, like their ales, right? Because they're sold sort of at room temperature.
That was the thing that got me the most when you're at a pub and it's they give it to you and it's like, oh, it's lukewarm, thank you.
Yeah. This isn't necessarily like better or worse, but like service in like certain like waiters and waitresses, it's like you walk into a pub and like there's no host to greet you, right? And so you just sit down at a table, and if you don't ask, no one will come up to you. Like they will let you sit there for an hour and never say a word, right? It's only when you're like you gotta like flag somebody down or go to the bar, and then they'll help you. Right. And so like in some ways, like really, really nice, because like American service tends to be overly like they oh my God, what do you need? Let me get it all. Blah, blah, blah. And you're like, back off. Right. But other times we literally have sat in restaurants for like a half hour, like waiting for someone to come to us, and they never do. And we're like, oh, that would have been nice to know. But it's just one of those things you got to understand. Right. So
how were you treated? I mean, I have to imagine around the base, you hear an American accent, everyone knows. Like you're in the military, even you live on the base, even if you don't have your military attire on. I mean, what's the general sentiment when you were out and around?
For Americans, it was generally you're right, like around the base, nobody cared. But once we kind of got a little farther out, we go to London or whatever, people were generally like, you know, whatever about it. Some people would ask. But, you know, it was also like we kind of picked up the lingo a little bit of like you say, you know, hiya is sort of the greeting, and you say cheers just for like anything. Like, you know, you're going down like kind of a tight hallway and you got to sign it, kind of somebody steps off to the side to let you pass and you're like, cheers. Right. It's like, thanks, that sort of stuff. So that helps you blend in. But I would have people ask me, they're like, hey, what are you doing here? And it's sort of one of those like, you're like, is this like a terrorist that wants to like throw me in the back of a car and abduct me and, you know, like extort me for money from the government? So it's sort of, I would be like, oh, you know, I'm employed here. My company moved me over here. And they're like, oh, what company? And I'm like, oh, well, I work at an airport in you know, East Anglia. And they're like, oh, that's interesting. I'm like, yeah. And
company's name is Uncle Sam.
Yeah, right. And so I conveniently just leave out that my employer is the United States government, right? that sort of thing. So
that's interesting. Well,
yeah.
it's actually really interesting you brought up the Mexican thing, because I remember Ron, and Ron can talk about this, but when he lived in Singapore, he lived there for 1 year, and I remembered I was one of the first people to see him when he got back to the States. And he flew back, and I was like, hey, like, Ron, what do you want to eat? And he's like, I want Mexican so bad. And we went to this place, and there was like, there's like almost like the ridiculous, like no one would ever order because it's so much food. But because it's Mexican, it's like $23, right? It's not that expensive at all. And it was called the Conquistador. And it was 5 plates of food. And Ron, as you can imagine, he got the Conquistador, and he ate almost all of it. It was actually impressive to watch. I mean, Ron, you must have really been hankering for some Mexican.
Oh my goodness, I was. It's something where, so Singapore obviously has a very English background as well. And I think also just being that part of the world, there just isn't a huge demand for Tex-Mex. In fact, I think one of my favorite stories was going to a Taco Bell, which I found there was a Taco Bell there. They didn't sell a single thing on the menu that had beef in it. Now think about that one for a second.
Yeah.
So then I did find, and it's kind of weird, like you can kind of tell like some of the places, some of the restaurants where it was like, somebody somewhere maybe watched a movie or secondhand heard about someone who had Mexican food. And that was kind of like the basis for creating a restaurant.
Yeah.
Where you get something and you're like, wow, why are you? No. And that was the thing. So while I've heard from one of our guests that came on, a good friend of the show, he mentioned that they have since got some really good Mexican there. That was something that I sincerely missed. And I think the other thing with that too was, at least in Singapore, the serving sizes for drinks. So if you ordered like a water, they give you a really tiny little kid's cup size of water.
Like a shot glass?
I mean, it's a little bit bigger, but like, in America, it's like you go to most restaurants and they're like, here you go. Here's your
half a gallon of water.
Right.
Or soda or whatever.
Right. And you're like, cool, 64 ounces of water. That's exactly what I need for this meal. So I was happy to kind of get back to that as well, oddly enough.
Well, let's kind of switch gears a little bit. You serve in the Air Force, you talked about. I know you're involved in logistics. What the heck is that?
Yeah, so logistics is, the way we like to talk about it is getting the right stuff to the right place at the right time. And so it's all just it's about moving stuff and then like warehousing and keeping your stuff, right? So in the military, that tends to be a little bit pigeonholed, but on the civilian side and in the civilian world, it's generally called supply chain management, but they're kind of the same thing. It's about your product, right? And so whatever company, whatever you sell, you have logistics to get that product from your manufacturer to the customer. So I would say 10, 15 years ago, people were like, I don't give a shit about logistics. And then this little company called Amazon came along and they're like, logistics is all we do. And everybody was like, this is the greatest thing ever. And so that's sort of what we do.
So you are the Amazon of the military.
Yeah, there's other things, but we're not nearly as cool. We have a lot less robots, but yeah.
Very cool. Well, last military question, I guess military specific question. I remember when I think we were sophomores and in college, and we would host movies. You and I, and by we, it was you who would host the movies, but I would come over and we'd bring some other people around with us. And we would watch movies. And I remember one night we watched Top Gun, one of my favorite all-time movies, right? And then the people we were with at the end, because we were like buddies, they called me Goose. They called you Maverick, which I didn't like because that meant I died in the end. But now that you've been in the military for a while, you've been on a lot of different bases. I mean, I love that movie, but what's your take on that movie now? Like, A, do you still like the movie? And B, is it even like remotely watchable at this point, or is it just like comical?
Yeah. So the thing I hate about Top Gun is it's actually a Navy movie. So the best Air Force movie is actually a Navy movie, which is the worst thing ever. But no, I love Top Gun. It is. I mean, that stuff actually happens, right? That sort of training and things like that. There's a lot of sort of tomfoolery in it, and it is very much like sort of not about the military. Absolutely love it. I'm excited for the sequels. So I will say that the movie, also with Tom Cruise, what is it, A Few Good Men, with him and Jack Nicholson, that one is much more about the military and sort of what we do. So, but love me some Top Gun. That movie's awesome.
All right. So, question on that: how much of your time in the military is spent playing volleyball, hanging with the boys? Because I need to know.
I mean, I would say like a solid 95% of it. Yeah. Yeah.
And how much of the time when you're at bars do you sing "You Got That Lovin' Feeling"?
I mean, we just carry mixtapes around us with that song just on loop, really. So
that's all I needed to hear. It makes perfect sense now. Hey, listen, serious. We're having a lot of fun here with Dave. We're gonna go to commercial break, but when we come back, we're gonna talk a little bit more about being a father, right? How he's been traveling all over the world, and we're also gonna get a little nerdy. Dave and I, when we were in college, we played a little game called Warhammer 40K. I want to see what he's up to regarding that. We'll be right back.
What's up, guys? This is Ruben. You may remember me as being the first ever guest on the Between Two Studs podcast. I'm here now to promote my podcast, Guys Who Cry. Me, along with my co-host Adam Cook, we talk about a wealth of topics ranging from crying, men crying, because it's something we all do, to, some lighter things. For example, our newest episode, Adam and I talked about our dating blunders and just weird date stories. So guys, if you would be so kind, head on over to Spotify, Anchor, Apple, iTunes, and hit that follow button. Talk to us. Our Instagram is at Guys Who Cry Official. That is Guys Who Cry Official. Check us out. We'd love to hear from you.
And we're back. We're hanging out with our good friend Dave Miller. He was just telling us all about what he does for the Air Force. He was living as an expat in England for a couple of years. And then, Dave, you come back. You're in California. You're outside of Sacramento. What was that like? What was like? Walk me through. You're done with your couple of years in England, and then do they say, "Hey, here's 5 options," or is it like, "Nah, you're going to California"? Like, what happens?
Yeah. So you move every 2 to 3 years. They tell you how long an assignment's going to be. There's a little bit of science, a little bit of magic that goes on, right? So you kind of say, they tell you, hey, these are the openings that we have. These are the places we need to fill. And then you sort of like say, these are the ones I would like to go to. And then at that point, there's some guys up at some basement dwellers that like do all this gonkulation, and they decide, hey, you get to go here. So I lucked out. I wanted to go to California, Travis Air Force Base, and that was my number 1 pick, and I got to go there. So we got really lucky. It was a great assignment. It was awesome. Travis is, as a logistics officer, everything is about cargo planes, right? Because nobody cares about an empty C5. They care about what you can put on it, what you can move with it, right? And
so you're playing a game of Tetris. How much can I get on this?
Absolutely, right? Yeah.
So your years of Tetris in your youth has really paid off in dividends.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, now granted, like I'm an officer, right? So I'm not like doing that per se, but I'm managing the guys that are playing the Tetris game, right? And so it's awesome to see that happen. So Travis is a huge hub for moving cargo out to the Pacific. And so just seeing all the stuff we get to put on planes and go and do cool stuff was awesome. So
now, question for you: when it comes to your selections for different assignments in the Air Force, like what's kind of like the one that everyone wants, and what's the one that nobody wants?
Yeah, everybody wants to go to Hawaii. Yeah, it's Pearl Harbor is the creme de la creme. After that, it's sort of the overseas bases, Japan and Germany, and then to a lesser extent, sort of some of the islands and that sort of stuff. There's a handful that nobody wants to go to. New Mexico, like center of the desert, nothing around you. New Mexico. There's some in like South Carolina, a bunch of ones in Texas. There's a lot of Air Force bases have a tendency to be sort of built in the middle of nowhere because Normal people are not like, oh yeah, I would love to buy a house next to an airfield that is constantly flying planes 24/7 all the time, buzzing my house. That's not a thing that people want, right? So Air Force bases and planes like to have nice flat areas with lots of wind, which tend to be not very populated. So there's a lot of Air Force bases just in the middle of nowhere that nobody wants to go to. So yeah.
Gotcha. And speaking of Texas, that's where you're at now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just, as you mentioned at the start of the show, you've got a daughter now. You're 6 months old. Congratulations. That's awesome. Yeah. How have you enjoyed Texas so far?
I will say I haven't liked it very much. However, we moved here in July of 2020, right? Like dead center of the COVID shenanigans. And we're sort of just now getting out of that. So I don't feel like I've been able to experience it. Like I dined out at a restaurant for the first time in over a year last Saturday, right? And so it's just, I haven't been anywhere, gone and seen anything. That being said, Texas generally is pretty red, especially our area. I'm a pretty liberal kind of guy. So just the policies they enact, I'm just not a fan of. But also just there's this like weird sort of like machismo with Texas, right? The whole like don't mess with Texas, everything's bigger in Texas kind of thing. And I'm just not a fan of it. So, but I see why some people like living here, right? Because if you're one of those guys that's like, don't mess with me, I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm like, man, Texas is the place for you. So,
well, it's interesting. And I actually wanted to bring it up. So I'm glad you did. I remember when we were in college, we would always get into really interesting political discussions. They were never debates. They were always discussions because I think we really respected each other. And this podcast, for the record, is not an overly political show. We don't really want to get into it too much. But yeah, I always knew you was a pretty liberal guy. And not only are you in a pretty conservative state, but I would guess, and I could be wrong, I would guess in your career, military, at least the stereotype has always been a little bit more on the conservative side.
Yeah.
With that, I mean, is that hard? You know, do you have to kind of hide your political opinions with the guys sometimes, or?
So I want to address the stereotype a little bit. The military is a cross section of society, right? For good and bad. And so we have all types. Right. So the idea that everybody in the military or most people in the military are very conservative and super America, like in my personal opinion and in my experience, I have not found to be true. We generally have all different spectrums of the political side. Right. And at the same time, like we have pedophiles and rapists and drug abusers and all the negative sides of society that you see as well. So
just because it's when you look at the national average, you're going to have that.
Right. Exactly. Right. Now, I would say, like, if you polled the whole military, we would probably trend more conservative than the average, but not to the extent that most people would assume. Right. So it's pretty well mixed. Now, that being said, the military is by design apolitical, and so we are not generally allowed to speak our views on politics. Right? By law, we cannot make disparaging comments about the president or elected officials. But like it sort of goes into we generally just don't share our personal political views at work. So it'll be things like, oh, did you see what the president that law the president passed the other day? Oh yeah, I saw that. Then it'll be interesting to see the effects of it.
I see. So you don't get into, like, when you're at the lunchroom, you're not getting into big discussions about.
Generally, no. Grant, you can kind of pick up some people, sort of what they're feeling, right? By what are the topics they bring up, that sort of thing. But for the most part, we avoid any real sort of big, political discussions, right?
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting because, yeah, again, I think that's a natural stereotype in the same way you think about, Hollywood is super liberal, or the media, right? Where it's like television, super liberal, radio can be conservative. You have these overarching buckets, some of it which might be true. And I always wonder, okay, well, if you're someone who is in that type of medium, and you fall in the other camp, do you feel like do you feel in
Right.
an awkward position? But it sounds
Yeah.
like that's not really, you don't really get into politics with anyone to begin with.
Right. Yeah. And like the apolitical side is like so big that I think his name was McMasters, but he said in an interview that he has never voted in a national election ever because he did not want to be swayed by one political party or the other. Like he was like, I'm in the military. I will not vote for president or anything like that because I am completely apolitical. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's sort of like that idea of like the military does not pick political parties taken to the extreme, right?
Well, that's an interesting point, and that you brought it up earlier too, where it's illegal to say anything disparaging against the president of the United States. And in a way, at first, I was like, "Oh my God, that seems extreme." But at the end of the day, that's your commander in chief, so I get it, right? There has to be a respect for the office, even if you don't respect the person in the office.
Yeah, right. And we can disagree with their policies, but it gets weird, and most of us just sort of generally avoid the topic in general.
Fair. Let's switch topics and something a little bit more fun. How's fatherhood been? I mean, what's any big surprises?
It's good. It's good. So our daughter Gwen, she's super cute. I can hear her crying upstairs right now, and I'm like, oh man, she's a really good sleeper for the most part. Since we brought her home, she's like, you put her down for bed and she sleeps 10, 11, 12 hours, like the whole time. Like it's been really good. She's a super chill baby, doesn't get like really excited about stuff, right? But also doesn't get super like upset. Like you like, oh, here's this toy, whatever, super exciting. And she's like, okay, like it just, my parents were here last week and my in-laws were here the week before and got to meet her, and which was super great. Parenthood changes things, right? And so it's just one of those things where it's just you're always considering, like even just filming this show, right? I'm like, I cannot do anything before 8 p.m. because that's bedtime, right? And just stuff like that, right? Or what are we going to do this weekend? Well, we have to plan things around nap time, just stuff like that, and it just, it really changes how you have to decide to do things. So, but it's great. I don't think I would change it.
Any advice for future fathers? My wife is not pregnant, for the record. I'm just saying I plan to be a father someday in the future.
Sure. Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, especially with the dawn of the internet, like you can get advice for everything, right? And so try not to like take all of it, right? Like parse it out and decide what you want to do. Also, just communication with the mother is just huge, right? Just talk to each other, because it's so easy to like get your head stuck in the sand, and you got to talk to each other, right? And communicate about what are you feeling, what's making you happy, that sort of stuff, because otherwise it'll just be miserable.
I guess one more question for you too is what's next for the Millers, and will you be in Texas for a while, or are you looking to kind of go anywhere else?
Yeah, so this is a 2-year assignment for us. We got here last summer, so we'll leave in summer of 22. We're not sure yet. So the list of available locations will come out in August. We'll see. We maybe want to go back overseas, so maybe Hawaii, maybe Japan. Not sure. So it's one of those, like, we can't make a decision until we see the list. You can't get super funneled into a plan because things constantly change in the military, and so we just take it as it comes.
I think that's all you can do. You got to be adaptable. Hey, so let's switch gears. Let's get a little nerdy, Dave.
What?
I know. I think, let's be honest, when we lived in K-Hall together, Killinger, I think we were probably known as two of the nerdiest guys. But we were like cool nerds, right? Like, it's like we knew how to talk to people.
Yeah.
Right? We weren't like stumbling as we talked to people.
Right.
But we'd also be the guys that on a Friday night, we'd be down in the basement playing Warhammer 40K.
Can I sidebar here a little bit on like nerddom and what it means to be a nerd, because
totally,
absolutely,
that has the goalpost has moved so much, right? Because like even in the 10 years since we met, right? 12 years at this point. But like I feel like back then, like you had to be playing 40K in the basement or like watching anime all the time to like be a nerd, right? And nowadays, like everybody watches Marvel movies and Star Wars, and like they're like, I'm a nerd, it's great. And I'm like, you what? Like,
right? You weren't ostracized in college.
Yeah. Exactly. Right.
You're totally right on that. It is funny. Like it's now, nerddom has entered pop culture.
Yeah.
Like Kim Kardashian, for all I know, is watching the Marvel movies, and so it's not weird anymore to be someone who's like, yeah, I read Uncanny X-Men or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a valid point, but I still think Warhammer 40K is pretty nerdy, and people would be like, I remember we would go down like on a Friday night, we'd order pizza, we'd play, and people would be like, what are you guys doing? And you were better than I was at painting. You were really good at it. And I had the orcs, and I had so many units. Anyway, I'm getting on a tangent here, but I want to talk to you about it. Like, are you still playing those games?
Yeah. So 40K, like I played, I think I started playing like that freshman year and sophomore year of college. And I played it kind of throughout college, and then I moved on to a different game called War Machine and Hordes. Played that while I was in England and California, and then when I moved back to Texas, nobody was playing that game. Everybody only played 40K, so I'm kind of back on the 40K game now. So it sort of shifts, but there's so many different miniatures games out there, right? And it's a little bit of you play what other people are playing, right? So, but it's awesome.
What race are you currently playing with Warhammer?
So I have a little bit of Imperial Guard, which is like the bog standard humans that they got regular rifles and body armor. And then I recently started playing the Death Guard, which are the Space Marines that have been infected by the god Nurgle, who is the god of decay and disease, and they are all pus ridden and diseased, and they're very hard to kill, but they're sort of slow and inexorable. So
that's very cool. I know Alex and I we played some 40K as well, and I guess one question with that too, just for our listeners, I'm sure they're like, wait, what's this 40K? Is that some kind of text form or sheet that you fill out? What is 40K?
So Warhammer is a game. It's a miniature war game, right? So there's many different types within the genre, but essentially it's you build and paint small toy soldiers. They're usually around an inch or two tall, and then you battle on a physical tabletop with physical terrain and such against another player. And so you move your models and you measure with rulers, and to determine effects you roll dice. It's a bit like chess, but sort of without the board. It's a lot more freeform.
That's how I always described it to people. I said, imagine taking chess and combining it with like a futuristic version of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And you have these individual pieces that all can do different things. And you're basically rolling a lot of dice to figure out who's going to win the battle and who's going to die.
Right.
And a healthy dose of rule lawyering. Don't get me wrong on that. That's
true.
That's one thing I don't like about that game is it's like you have to have a codex just for how the game plays.
Right.
You then have to have a codex for your units. And then you kind of have all these other rules that kind of work in where I have to know a little bit about your army so that I can also know about your rules, so that I don't know that you're just making up stuff as you go.
Yeah, for the record, for anyone listening who's like, this sounds really fun, I want to get into it, just be forewarned, it's a very expensive hobby.
So like people do say that. I think that miniature wargaming is not any more expensive than, say, video games or, I don't know, like playing a musical instrument or whatever. It's a hobby, right? And so obviously it is like this isn't feeding me, so it's extra money, but I would say it's in line with most other pursuits, right?
That's probably fair. If you were to buy a video game system, you buy the controllers, you buy the games. That's probably fair, but it's certainly, you would agree that it is several hundreds of dollars to really get up and going.
Absolutely. The cost to entry is definitely there. The other thing there is a time to entry, right? So you buy a box of miniatures, there is several hours of assembly, and then it is generally optional but highly encouraged to paint them as well. And there is infinite amount of hours of painting, but at the minimum you're talking an hour or two for each individual trooper, just at the minimum. So there's a lot of time investment just getting yourself to a place where you can start to play, right? Whereas you buy an Xbox, you plug that baby in, you pop that disc in, and you're off to the races, right? So it's a bit more of a slow grind, but at the same time, I think that you look at sort of the dollar per hour earned, right? You get a box of troopers for $50, some paint and brushes. You easily have 10 to 15 hours of play just in that box. But then once you've assembled and painted those guys, you will play with them for hours and hours and hours and hours. I know guys that have had those same painted miniatures for 20 years. They're still playing with them, right? Whereas you buy your Call of Duty or whatever, same sort of price range. You finish playing in 15 to 20 hours. How often are you going to go back and revisit that game, right? Now you're buying another game. So I don't know. It's just different.
I think that's a really good point that you bring up. Of course, this assumes that you enjoy painting, which I always did. I think it's very much a social. It was kind of fun. Like Ron and I would go to one of the stores, one of the Warhammer Games Workshop stores, and they would have very much. It was almost like a lounge area where they were totally fine, where you just hanging out painting. And you get to talk to people and you go, oh, wow, you did that scheme. That's really fun. And that's really cool. And look what I did. And it very much like there's a game outside of the game itself.
Yeah. The thing I love about miniature wargaming is that there is both a solo aspect and a community multiplayer aspect, right? Of you could just spend infinite amount of hours painting by yourself at home, but at the same time there's also, to go and play, you have to go and find a person in person and play with them. And so like COVID hits, right? And everybody's like, oh, I can't do the things that I love. And I'm like, well, I guess I'm just going to do more painting, right? And just set aside the gaming aspect. And so I love that you can interchange those two aspects freely, right? Whereas like if your pastime is playing poker, like you can't physically get in a room with people, you're not playing poker. So it's just, I enjoy that part of it.
And one thing as well too with 40K is there's also this huge lore universe. So there's people, like, you could read tons and tons of books that really get into history. So yeah, it's like, it's one of those weird hobbies where you have people who are just super into the lore, super into the painting, or super just into the gaming itself.
Yeah.
And it's kind of cool.
I gotta say, I love the painting, but in hindsight, I regretted picking orcs because Ron would have like 5 pieces. Actually, you too, Dave. You'd have like 5 pieces and they'd be beautiful and you'd have so much time for all of them. And I'd have like 50 pieces that I had to paint every single one of them. And like, of course, by the time you get to like 35, you're like, all right, I need to hurry this up because I want to play. And I felt like it's like less is more, right? Like you could really go into the minute details when you have less pieces.
Yeah, there is definitely an aspect of that. So yeah, but I don't know. I also play. That's why I have the 2 armies that I play, right? Because Imperial Guard is like you paint one guardsman 200 times, right? But then I also have my Death Guard, who are every single one of them is different and unique and has different details and that sort of thing. And so I can sort of lavish detail on those guys, and everybody's different. So I get both sides of it, right?
you've had a lot of adventures, and you're living in Europe, and then actually, when you were living in Europe, we talked about it. We hinted at it at the beginning of the show where I met you. We were in Oktoberfest in Munich. And what are your thoughts on Oktoberfest? And if you wouldn't mind, even give our listeners maybe a little bit of give us a lay of the land. Describe the scene, describe the experience, the feel.
Sure. Yeah. So Oktoberfest it's basically just a big fair, right? Like, so there's like rides and there's games and whatever. And then, but at the same time, you have these beer halls and there's these big giant tents, right? And it's all just done in this big field. They set up the tents just for the couple weeks that Oktoberfest is. And you have to kind of get tickets to go into the halls and whatever. But once you get in there, they serve beer, and they like only serve beer in liters, right? Which if you're not familiar with a liter, like the Nalgene bottles, right, are liters, and it's a lot of beer. And
well, it's you think about it, a liter is about 29 ounces or so. So you're having about 3 beers, right? From a 12-ounce standpoint, 2.5, right? But you're going through those. And the thing that threw me for the loop the most, Dave, I don't know about you, was I sort of thought, oh, you go to Oktoberfest, every brewery has their own tent, and you kind of bar hop. And that is not what you do at all. Like, you find you there, it's so difficult to get a ticket or to go in, right? You got to get there early or you get a ticket, right? And so you get to your spot, you get your table, and then you plop. And you're going to plop there, and you're going to be there for 6-8 hours. I mean, you're putting in a work shift. And you're drinking beer and eating pretzels for 6 to 8 hours. And you're going to get drunk. I mean, it's inevitable. Yeah. It's inevitable.
Absolutely.
A liter is 33.8 ounces. So, yeah, it is 3 full beers.
And so, so super, super awesome radio here, but I actually have the liter Steins from Munich. So this is a classic Alex Studd story I have to tell here, right? So we are in the Spaten Brewery beer tent at Munich, right at Oktoberfest, and we're like, guys, we got to take these mugs with us. These
which,
Steins.
By the way, is super illegal.
Totally
you're not supposed to do that.
Totally not that, right? So we're
not condoning this behavior.
No. But we are 3 or 4 liters in at this point. Like we are super drunk. So we're wearing lederhosen, right? Which is the leather pants. And lederhosen are kind of baggy, right? They got some wiggle room in there for the boys to jangle around, right? So I unbutton my lederhosen, and I take this Stein by the handle and I stick it down in my lederhosen, right? And my wife, she's got the dirndl, the dress on, and it's got a little apron. So she grabs 2 of them and puts them under her apron. And we're like, all right, Auf Wiedersehen, like whatever. And we like waddle our way, right? And so I got this giant Stein in between my knees. And we all like waddle our way out. And then like, we're like, fuck yeah, we got our Stein. So I still have these Steins from when we went to Munich.
I am so thankful you brought this story up, because downstairs I have the one that Irene carried out for me. And it was funny because the Stud boys, Ron and I and our father, we were in Europe for 2 full weeks. We culminated in Munich, where we met up with you and Irene. And we were in Munich, and I remember we were sitting at that table drunk out of our minds. And I was thinking to myself, oh, I really should get Hannah a gift for this trip. And you and Irene got me the liter Stein, and we got it. And I remember giving that to Hannah, and she was so thrilled by it. I said, this came from an actual beer hall in Munich. So I'll always be indebted. I have it downstairs. I'll always be indebted to you and Irene for that.
So that's awesome. That is like every time I think of Alex Studd, I think of like going to Munich and smuggling those steins out. So,
Well, and my favorite part of Oktoberfest was it's this big flat area that Dave explained earlier, right? There's like Ferris wheels and all these like rides, which I don't know why anyone who's drinking would want to get on those rides, but they're available.
there's like kids and stuff there too. Like people bring their families.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But the last thing, after drinking 4 or 5 liters, the last thing I want to do is get on a roller coaster. But I get your point. I remember this big flat area, and then there was this big open area off to the side, like probably a quarter mile away, where there was this hill. And this hill, we saw people out in the distance. Like, it was just far enough away that you could see. And there were all these people just hanging out there. And I was talking, the beauty of when you go to Oktoberfest is it's kind of like the UN, where it's like you're talking to people and we all know different languages, and you're kind of like, oh, that guy knows a little English. Oh, and Dave was with us and he knows a little German. Oh, and this guy knows a little French, right? And you're all like trying to communicate. I remember we were talking to some guy. We're like, what's with that hill over there? And it was a German word that basically translated to like jackass hill or something like that, which basically just meant if you're drinking at a beer hall and you get so drunk and your friends are like, well, I don't want to leave, they'll just drop you off at that on that hill, and they'll go back to the beer hall to keep drinking.
And I remember like the cops and the paramedics sort of zigzag up and down this hill, and they're, hey, are you alive? Hey, oh, okay, this one's too drunk. He's got to go to the hospital. And yeah.
Oh, well, thinking back on all of it, one of the things that I was really impressed by, especially as Alex is describing, I do remember we were drinking like 4 or 5 liters, which I wouldn't condone, but on the other hand,
when in Munich during Oktoberfest, that's what you do.
The one thing I was super impressed with, and I'm not sure if this is German engineering or not, but the restrooms, at least for the men's, it was kind of its own weird thing. Like, so normally like in the US, we have like, if you go to a big sporting event, like, yeah, you have like those troughs that everyone kind of goes in. This was like troughs taken to the next level. It was like troughs with mazes. And the way that the maze was kind of set up, it was like there's no way that you can go through it's a one way. So even if you're really, really stumbling around, you'd come into that. There was always room, at least in the guys, because it was just trough maze. And then you'd always go out. It was, I don't know. I don't remember.
I agree. It was zigzag so much that I think by the time you got through, it sort of created a natural attrition where it was like by the time you got through the maze, it gave up enough people who were using the troughs to leave.
Right.
It was like a natural system.
Yeah.
Which, when you have that many people drinking and that many people have to go, I was impressed. That was something I've never seen before or since, but I don't know. That was something that I found impressive. From a logistics standpoint, there's some thinking that went into that one.
Oh, yeah.
It seems pretty obvious, but would you recommend anybody who likes to drink to experience Oktoberfest once in their life? What's your take, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. Like super interesting cultural event, right? Really, really cool. Munich, honestly, is just a really nice city in general, very walkable. But yeah, it's definitely one of those, like, you want to go with some friends, right? Like you got to kind of get a crew together. Like that's not a solo sort of trip, right? But yeah, absolutely.
I remember, and I'm a little embarrassed to tell this story, but it embarrasses Ron and our father all at the same time. I remember we were planning on meeting up with you and Irene. It was before we all went out together, right? Because you arrived a couple days after we arrived. Might have been the next day, actually. But the 3 studs, we all went out to Oktoberfest, which is this area, like this giant field, like just west of downtown. And we got really drunk. And I remember saying to my brother and dad, and I said, "Oh, we gotta get downtown. We gotta get to Marienplatz."
I remember that.
Yeah, I said we gotta get to Marienplatz because Dave and Irene, they're meeting us there. And we were so drunk, and we of course didn't know any German. And we talked to this one guy, and he's like, "Well, just go downstairs and take the subway, and you'll get there in like 5 stops." And I think in my arrogance, I said, we don't need no subway. Let's just walk. And we just started walking. And it was one of those things where like I was in the middle and I was holding my brother and my dad, we were on each arm, we're holding each other. And like every block we'd go up like 1 or 2 blocks, and then we'd have to ask somebody. And of course, again, no German. We'd be like, Marienplatz. And then a German would like point in the right direction. And eventually we made our ways there. So we were obviously like the American drunk assholes. But I remember I felt kind of embarrassed, Dave. And I don't know if I ever apologized for this. So I'll apologize here once and for all if I never did. I remember showing up and you and Irene were like completely sober, like, oh, really excited to meet Mr. Stud and your brother. Let's go out and have dinner. And we were smashed.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That was
I do remember that fondly, because that whole experience when we were talking to the guy who was like, yeah, just go down into the train station and just, it's like 2 or 3 things up. I think we were all just feeling pretty good. Like, you know how like you feel that sometimes? And yeah, so we just kind of hoofed it, and it's a miracle. We kind of eventually made it to the Marienplatz. But I do remember too, we also took a bunch of really unusual photos of other things. And by the way, David, this is something that's kind of a little bit lesser known knowledge about our show. Oddly enough, we have a ton of German listeners. I don't know why, but we love you guys. So anybody who is from Munich or who's been to Munich, who can actually look at the logistics of walking from the Tetris-ing, right, to the Marienplatz, you can figure out how many blocks that was. But it was definitely a fun walk, especially with multiple beers in us.
That's awesome. Well, you know, so living in England, it's just a short hop to Europe, and so we ended up going to, God, I think 15 different countries or whatever, right? Just so many different places. And this I would say anybody that's going to go do some traveling in a non-English speaking country, just knowing the most basic of language opens doors for you. Just knowing how to say like hello and like please and thank you and some way of communicating that you don't speak English, just huge, right? So we went to Paris, and everybody was like, oh God, the Parisians are all assholes. They hate Americans, like worst service, whatever. And we memorized, right? Like, hello, and do you speak English? And we would walk into places and say that. And most of the time it was like, yeah, absolutely. Of course we speak English. Let me get you an English menu. Sit down here. This will be great. Or they'd be like, ooh, I don't, but let's muddle our way through, right? And just that little bit of effort of like, hey, I learned some of your language. Can you help me? Was huge, right? And a lot of times, like when we went to Norway, Norwegians like real hard. All I could memorize was the word English, which is Engelsk, right? And so I would just hello Engelsk, and they'd be like, all right, clearly doesn't know Norwegian, but maybe
He tried,
right? And that would open doors for us, right? So
Dave, this has been such a delight. It's been fun going down memory lane, catching up with what you've been up to. So proud and happy for both you and Irene with your beautiful 6-month-old daughter. And we're just really happy to have you on the show.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This was awesome.
Thank you. And that concludes episode 22 of